we covered Genesis chapter 14, which concluded with Abram back in the land that God had led him to out of Ur, with this strange encounter with an odd king/priest named Melchizedek, priest of the Most High God. And Abram left that encounter more willing, more determined to trust on God. And so when offered the chance to divide the loot and the plunder, the offer was made by the king of Sodom. Abram declined, and Lot went with the king of Sodom back into Sodom, and Abram is back in the land where he began before the drought that led him to Egypt, and I would say he's trying to trust and rely on God. But as chapter 15 will show us, he still has questions. Chapter 15 is one of the most iconic in the Abraham narrative. As I was reading over it in the last week, I think it's true that for most of my life, I thought that this chapter was the original moment where the first moment where God made the promises to Abraham, because it's got him looking at the stars. Mm-hmm. It doesn't have the passage where he's told that his offspring will be as many as the sand by the seashore, but it has that moment where he's asked to look at the stars, and we'll get to that in a little bit. And it's very memorable. And Christians, when they would later cite the faith of Abraham, this passage often seems to be humming in the background. You can read quotes from it in Romans 4:3, then also verses 20 through 24, Galatians 3:6, Hebrews 11, verse 1, and then 8 through 12, and then James 2, verse 23, all draw from this passage when they're trying to describe the sort of faith that we should have in God, and Abraham as the prime example of that. As I said, this chapter comes just after Abram has rejected the allure of Sodom's wealth, made way by plunder, and has instead chosen to trust the Lord God. But Abram has questions. He seems to be wanting to trust God, but is not sure if God is going to keep the promises that God made. So this is also the first time that we read a dialogue between God and Abram, the first time we have a back and forth relational conversation. Up to this point, it's been God dictating to Abram what to do, and Abram responding, but not really asking any questions or offering any feedback to the things that God is saying. Chapter 15 has two distinct sections. Verses 1 through 6 contain a dialogue about Abram's offspring and whether God will make offspring possible. And then verses 7 through 21 are viewed as a separate, distinct section that is woven into the narrative as if it were one long dialogue. And it has to do with God's promise for land for Abram's children and children's children. The source of verses 1 through 6 is disputed, and there's no scholarly consensus. However, verses 7 through 21 is assigned to the Yahwist source, the J source. So to the text, beginning with verse 1 of chapter 15. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. The expression, the word of the Lord came in verse 1 and then in verse 4, is so common among the prophets, like Jeremiah and Isaiah. Oftentimes, the prophetic vision begins with this, but this is the only place in the Pentateuch, in the first 5 books of the Bible, where this phrase is used. So this links it to prophetic texts that the first readers of the Pentateuch, as it was finally compiled, would have been aware of. And this cues us into the fact that what we're about to receive is a very important announcement. The announcement in this case is a promise. And then the next thing out of Lord God's mouth is, do not be afraid. Lord God seems to know from the onset that Abram is apprehensive and uncertain. Although Abram has not named this anxiety explicitly, but God takes the initiative to engage and affirm Abram in his doubts, almost as if preemptively. This is a God who cares about the mental well-being and the fortitude of Abram, and is trying to get out ahead of his anxiety, perhaps. And Abram, we find in verse 2 and verse 3 that he does have anxiety about the fulfillment of these promises that were made to him back in chapter 12. The text reads, "But Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir to my house is Eliezer of Damascus." And Abram said, "You have given me no offspring, and so a slave born in my house is to be my heir." It, as has been noted in earlier classes, the Jewish people did not believe in an afterlife as many now conceptualize it. It was believed that one lived by way of their offspring, and that to live beyond the grave, one must have children. So what's at stake here is more than a question of who will inherit all the goods for Abram. What's at stake is his legacy going into the future, and even more than his legacy, his ability to live on through his children and children's children after the fact. The Hebrew, this is just an interesting point, nothing to run away with. It's just a kind of a question mark that I find intriguing. The Hebrew here, translated as Eliezer of Damascus, is difficult to translate. First off, we're not sure that this is an accurate translation, and there's been questions about how to even translate the Hebrew. But if Eliezer of Damascus is correct, or even if it's not, this mysterious character is only mentioned in this passage. And I love stuff like that. Where a character is named and then dropped with really no context, just a big question mark. I don't know why I like stuff like that. It always makes me, I guess it just makes the Bible more mysterious in a way that I find exciting. But point is, no point, I guess, is that this is the only time this person is mentioned. We have no idea who this is, except to say that apparently it's a servant or slave of Abram. And why this servant or slave would be the one to inherit, we don't know. But moving on, Abram is concerned about God's apparent delay in bringing about the promises made clear in chapter 12. Abram's questions provide the necessary backdrop for the central issue of the chapter, God's delay in fulfilling God's promises. The issue is the same as that faced by the prophet Jeremiah in his day. God's people, who should have been enjoying the promised blessing, find themselves instead about to enter captivity in Babylon. That's telescoping into the future, but it plays on a theme that is pretty constant in the life of Israel and the Jewish people, where they're always maybe on the cusp of a promise, but still waiting, and yet still trusting some of the time. Verse 4, "But the word of the Lord," again, very important phrase, word of the Lord, something, big announcement coming, prophetic announcement coming, "came to him." The word of the Lord came to him. "This man shall not be your heir. No one but your very own issue shall be your heir." He brought him outside and said, "Look toward the heaven and count the stars, if you are able to count them. Then he said to him, so shall your descendants be." And this is one of the more memorable moments in this passage. And it also led to lots of very beautiful pictures that I was able to select and plug into the presentation today. Pictures of the sky, very, very beautiful, wonderful color scheme. There's not much to say about this passage that hasn't already been said or spoken of in sermons, and it's pretty straightforward. God doubles down on the promises made earlier, and in no ambiguous terms. It will be Abram's seed that produces the child. But note, the mother in question is still a live issue. This will cause trouble in later chapters, especially beginning in next chapter, chapter 16, which we'll discuss next week, when Abram fathers a child by way of his servant Hagar, at the instruction of his wife Sarai, I might add. We'll talk more about that in depth next week. But in calling Abram's attention to the stars, Abram is reminded that God is the creator of those stars, and if God can cause the stars, God can fulfill a promise for offspring. There is no way to count the stars to get our minds around the infinite. So shall it be with Abram's offspring. This next verse is the one that is quoted in later Christian scriptures, the ones that I mentioned earlier in Galatians and in Romans and Hebrews and the book of James. And it reads, "And he believed the Lord," he being Abram believed the Lord, "and the Lord reckoned it to him," him being Abram, "as righteousness." And traditionally, interpreters have taken this verse to mean that upon Abram's believing the Lord, Abram is then determined to be righteous. So it is because Abram had the faith, was able to muster up the faith or the ability to trust, that Abram was declared righteous. And so if that's the way that we read it, it means that Abram, believed in the Lord, and the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness. But I will point out that the second time the word Lord is mentioned in this text, so Abram, believed in the Lord, and the Lord, that second time, that's actually a translation of the pronoun he. A translation of the pronoun he. And many translators have thought that the he in question was the Lord. They're assuming that the Hebrew word for he, when used the second time, is in reference to Yahweh, that Yahweh is declaring Abram righteous because of his faith. And this certainly seems to be the way it functions in the Christian scriptures and the traditions. However, there is another reading that is more attractive to me and just as plausible. You could flip the coin. One is as plausible as the other because they're both accurate translations. It could just as well be read, he, Abram, believed the Lord, and he, Abram, reckoned it to him, Yahweh, as righteousness. In other words, Yahweh is the one who is righteous, and righteousness means that they do what is right, which makes sense in this passage when it has to do with whether or not God will follow through on the promises. My Bible professor from seminary, Ron Allen, writes, the latter rendering is preferred because Abram has trusted God, but to this point in the story, God has not fulfilled the promise. God's righteousness, not Abram's, has been in question. Abram, however, declared that God is indeed righteous. God coming to Abram has as much as made the promise certain. And then later, Allen says, and because God is righteous, we can trust God's promises. Righteousness is a relational term referring to doing what is right. So both of those readings, translations, are equally plausible. We really don't know who to ascribe these pronouns to in the back half of this sentence. But personally, this idea that Abram becomes righteous because he's able to muster enough faith, it almost leans on a kind of works righteousness, I guess, where believing hard enough gets you to the place you need to be, which I do think there is some truth in that. And of course, faith is more than a laudable Christian and Jewish virtue. And a lot of Abram's journey is just that, taking these steps in faith. But this idea that it is Yahweh that is the righteous one, the right one, that is reliable and trustworthy, and that being the point, makes sense to me within the broader scope of this chapter and what it seems to be about in the first place. So I don't know, you could take either reading and get something positive from it. And I also love verses that could be read two ways. They lead to lots of discussion and deep theological meanings as we're trying to pick apart which one is preferable to us and why. So that's verse 6. Long time on verse 6. Moving on. Verse 7. Then he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. But he said, O Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it? This is the next part of the chapter, the next section that is from the Yahwist source, scholars believe. And it shifted to a conversation not about offspring, but about land. And Abram wonders if this promise will be kept as well. What happens next is truly astonishing, and to modern readers, fairly weird as well. Verse 9, he said to him, he being Yahweh, said to Abram, bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. He brought him all these and cut them in two, laying each half over against the other, but he did not cut the birds in two. And when birds of prey came down on the carcasses, Abram drove them away. This seems to be describing a ritual that the readers would have known about because there's no explanation as to why they have to be 3 years old, why he did not divide the birds into half. And this comes into the narrative with really no explanation, as later rituals will be thoroughly flushed out when Moses is given new rituals for the Israelite people to obey. And while modern readers will likely find this passage odd, I almost certainly find this passage odd and perhaps disturbing, what we have here described is an ancient covenantal ritual by which two parties enter into a contract with one another, a binding contract with grave consequences if broken. Fritham writes in the New Interpreter's Bible Commentary, we do not know why the birds were the only animals not divided, why the animals had to be 3 years old, or the meaning of verse 11. That's the one where Abram is driving away the birds of prey. It does evoke some basic themes of the rite involving the life and death matter. At the least, Abram's vigilance and care in the preparation. So maybe Abram driving away the birds that are coming down is just evidence that he's taking this ritual very seriously and trying to be as faithful as possible to the commands of the Lord God. 12, verse 12. As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and a deep and terrifying darkness descended upon him. Then the Lord said to Abram, know this for certain, that your offspring shall be aliens in the land that is not theirs, and shall be slaves there, and they shall be oppressed for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for yourself, you shall go to your ancestors in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age, and they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. So Abram falls into a deep sleep. One is reminded of what happens when Jacob falls into a deep sleep and sees a divine vision in the darkness, foreboding. Darkness appears, writes Fritham, darkness appears integral to the rite, perhaps to shroud what God does. Such darkness symbolizes dreamlike seeing and knowing, which penetrates into the deepest recesses of Abram's being. These profound visions often come in the dark and in dreams. Israel's time in Egypt is foreshadowed in this dream, a bit of knowledge already well established at the time the Torah was compiled. Israel's perpetual wandering as foreigners in a land that was promised them is foreshadowed as well. Abram is told that he will die before this promise for land is fulfilled, but that his ancestors will experience the promise's fulfillment. This fits the pattern going forward. It seems that God's people will always be living as wanderers, yet believing that God is faithful and trustworthy, the promised land just on the horizon. So later readers of this would read it and say, yes, that makes sense. That is how life has been for us. Verse 17. When the sun had gone down and it was dark, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites and the Kenizzites and the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. Hybert writes in the Common English Bible Commentary, in the ancient Near East, two parties would sometimes bind themselves to each other by slaughtering and splitting animals. Next, the partners would walk between the pieces of animals, taking upon themselves the fate of the animal should they violate the covenant. In this ritual, God alone, symbolized by a fiery flame, passes between the pieces of animals. Abram himself slept deeply. So they don't both walk through, meaning that Abram, whether or not he is faithful, he is not going to be rent into pieces. God makes the vow to Abram, and nothing is asked of Abram in return except trusting reliance, believing God is righteous and faithful. Fritham writes, God, symbolized by the smoke and the fire, actually passes through the divided animals. These are my words here. I cannot overemphasize or overdramatize the theological claim being made here. It is astounding. When contracts/covenants were sealed by a ritual like this, those that walked through the animals were saying, if I break my promise that I'm making here today, may I be torn to pieces like these animals. In other words, if I don't keep the promise, I will die. In other words, if God does not follow through, God dies. God makes an oath putting God's own life on the line if the promises are untrue. Abram carries on afterward, believing that God is trustworthy and consistent. And after such a promise made by the creator of the universe, who could blame him? Some takeaways. First, Abram is invited to live in hope for a future that he will not see in full. His offspring will see far more of the promise fulfilled than he will, and yet he is called to live in expectation of the promise. Ron Allen writes, in Genesis 15, 18 through 21, God gives the land to Sarai and Abram. However, their descendants will not possess it until 4 generations have passed. Nevertheless, the couple experiences a prolepsis. More on that word in a second. Experiences a prolepsis. They live in the land as if it is already theirs. What would happen if in our churches, if we lived in the present as if it were a promised land? And I think he's contrasting that way of living with the anxiety that we often have when we don't feel like we have quite arrived or achieved what we are trying to arrive at or achieve as churches. So in other words, how if Christians lived as if we already have all that we need, even as we hope for a better future? Both can be true at the same time. Prolepsis defined the representation of a thing as existing before it actually does or did so. So think Advent, think Easter in the Christian tradition, where we are remembering an historic event, but we are also anticipating the presence of God in our lives. In the case of Advent, the arrival of Jesus into our community in a more profound, palpable way, or in the case of Easter, a resurrected life, not only on the other side of our grave, but also on the other side of every dark place as we pine for the world to be restored and remade in light of the realm of God. But in those moments, we get a taste of the future we hope for. It almost feels like the future comes into the present and we experience it, or as the hymnist writes, a foretaste of glory divine. That's prolepsis. And it's like Abram lives that way for the rest of his life. He never arrives at the promised land and yet knows that God is faithful and will keep the promise as it is manifest for generations to come. The overall point of this chapter is this, though. God keeps God's promises. If God does not, God is dead. I think that this must be true. What good is all of this God talk, these beliefs, these faith claims, these rituals and practices, if the God who made these promises will not follow through? One might wonder if such a God even exists. The promises only matter if God can/will keep them, if we have been promised new life in God, and if God is faithful to keep these promises. Then we have no reason to be afraid whilst living as strangers in a strange land. If God made the stars, God can see us through to our own promised land. Abram chooses to believe in the righteousness and constancy of God. This choice is still before us. Will we believe and join Abram on this journey through life, this journey that begins with a leap of faith? Here are the sources that I utilized most during the preparation for this week's Bible class. Now I will bring you back up so I can see your faces. So the part that got me the most excited was that this idea that God would participate in a covenantal ritual, where basically it's saying, if I don't keep these promises, and if God doesn't follow through, then God is saying my fate will be as these animals. In other words, I will die. And this idea that God could die is an unthinkable thought. So basically, God is saying, I'm good for it, and I will see you through. And I found that especially powerful and poignant. But I'm curious to know what you thought, or any questions you might have about this passage.
Yes, I have a question.
Sure.
The word Fretheim, F-R-E-T-H-E-I-M, appears frequently with a number behind it, like a reference number. Is that a book of the Bible?
No, it's an author. He wrote the New Interpreter's Bible Commentary. Well, he wrote the Genesis portion of the New Interpreter's Bible's commentary. And so it is a reference to him as the author when I'm quoting him, or citing him even if I don't quote him, with the page number from which it comes. And in the last page where it says sources cited, that's where you can actually find, that's the actual APA formatted citation list. I'm just making sure that I cite my sources.
Right, that's a good explanation. Thank you.
So I have a question.
Sure.
We don't ever know what happened to Lot, do we?
Think about that. He leaves. We'll get to that in several weeks from now. But he leaves Sodom and Gomorrah. His wife famously turns around and becomes a pillar of salt. He has made drunk by his daughters and
Mm-hmm.
father's children by them.
Yes.
And I can't remember what happens after that.
Okay.
And I've read it several times. Maybe you're right. Maybe we don't.
I was curious because it says he has no heirs. And although Lot was not his legal son, there's possibility suggested that he could have been like an adopted son. And so that's why I was thinking about Lot.
Yeah.
So you were saying that to the Jewish people, they would have understood this ritual, and they would have known what the smoking fire pot and flaming torch passing between the pieces would have meant, because I was like, what is that? And you explained it, but I would have had no idea what, and you explained what the meaning was, but that was in the commentary. Would anybody else reading it, would they have known, or?
Well,
I mean, it was just lost on me completely.
Flames and smoke are whether it's incense being burned or whether it's the flame. Think of the burning bush, Exodus, are symbolic manifestations of God's presence in a way that can, in the story, in the narrative, be seen and experienced. And then in this passage specifically, the next words out of Yahweh's mouth are, "I am covenanting with you." So this idea that that those are to represent God walking through the split animals becomes clearer from basically Yahweh saying, "This is me walking through as two partners." The reason I said that people would have understood this straight away is for one, there are sources that talk about this being a practice in the ancient Near East that predate Judaism. Animal sacrifice predates Judaism. It's kind of part and parcel with religious life in that area, whatever cult or deity you subscribe to, tribal cult or deity you subscribe to. But the fact that there is just no explanation and it just names what happens is a cue to me that the readers did not need an explanation. They understood, just like any other story that you might understand without any preface for it, and maybe another culture or time you'd have to say, wait a second, let me explain. When we say that they were running a phone bank, there were these things called phones, and phones are a technology that was, you'd have to give some context for certain things. And in this case, there was no context given, just drops in.
I think it's a cultural thing, like you said. And I relate it to in the story of Ruth, where I forget his name, but he hands Boaz his shoe. Okay, today, if somebody handed you their shoe, you'd walk away from them and turn around and go the other direction. And so, and to my knowledge, the reason why they offered the shoe is not known, or I've never heard why they offered the shoe. That's just what they did. That's the way they made it. That's the way they signed the agreement. And I think that this is the way at that time they signed the agreement.
Well, someday we'll get to that book. And there are puns and euphemisms that we'll talk about related to feet that I don't want to get into today because I'm afraid it'd become too much of a distraction. But just as we have puns and euphemisms today, things dealing with feet and shoes were a euphemism for something, and I'll leave it at that.
Okay.
So when Ruth uncovers his feet and he wakes up and goes, "Bless you, my child," on the threshing floor. I don't know if I want to go further into it, but
that was a sexual kind of thing.
yes,
Yeah.
it was. But we'll talk about that another day.
Yeah, but what I was thinking of was the Boaz said, but there's one that has the right to you before I can speak for you. And that was the person that gave Boaz the shoe.
Huh.
And
I forget that part. I'll have to look back at that.
so,
So
yeah.
that I'll just run through my questions really quick. So is there a map showing like the rivers and because it goes through the land, the river of Egypt, and then the land of the ites. And so is there a map somewhere that spells that out? It sounds like it's huge, but
Yeah, I can pull it up right now, actually, if
okay.
you like.
Yeah, that'd be
I'm
good.
going to do a screen share again. I'm just going to type in Euphrates, Nile River, and everything in between those is what's being described. Euphrates and Nile River maps. Oh, not that. Images. That's too small. Let me get a bigger one here.
It's hard to get big.
Well, I can.
Well, that is the one with the red lines.
Yes.
That's pretty big.
Here we go. So up here we have. Let's see if I can. You have the Tigris and the Euphrates up to your right, and the Euphrates, I believe, is the one on the right, and then the Nile is down here. So
Yeah.
we're talking the entire peninsula that is Saudi Arabia. You've got Jordan and Israel kind of right there in the middle. Yeah, but you're talking land that is far bigger than what Israel would end up becoming if those are the boundaries.
Yeah. That's huge. Yeah.
Yeah, that is.
Then the other question, this will probably come up, is about the iniquity of the Amorites is not complete. Now, the Amorites had been his allies in chapter 14. They brought him information about Lot. But now the Lord is saying that their iniquity is not complete. So I guess that's just a mystery that's going to.
Yeah, I don't know. And I have not looked deeply into that. And why for 4 generations? It seems somewhat arbitrary to say the iniquity of the Amorites is not complete. So consequently, your children will not inhabit it for 4 generations. And generations broadly meant a generation might mean something like 100 years.
Okay. All right. So I didn't miss some other subplot that was already brewing. Okay.
I could look more into that though, because I was as we were doing, I was practicing this earlier this morning, but then even as we were doing it live, I have no idea. It seems like a very interesting thread to pull. I love things like that, as I was mentioning earlier, like with the fellow from Damascus, Eliezer. Yeah, I love. That's why I probably spent too much time on the Nephilim. About a month and a half ago.
Yeah.
They're not really informative to our faith. Those sort of stories. They're just very intriguing. They hint at lost stories, lost narratives that the people who were reading the Torah in the early days might have known what those stories were. Perhaps they were part of some oral tradition that was well known. But now it's
kind of like that Melchizedek too.
Yeah. It's just
he comes and goes.
Yeah, I love stuff like that, and I don't know why I love stuff like that. It's not because I think it's the best, most. I don't think they're going to change our lives chasing down those threads, but I just find them fascinating, and I always have since I was a kid reading these stories.
I want to change the subject here a second.
Sure.
On the first page, I think, of today, There was a reference that had a capital J that was
Oh, yes.
What does that mean?
Well, early on, maybe the first or second lesson, we talked about what is fairly mainstream biblical interpretive theory, which is that the Torah is comprised of various sources: a priestly source, a Yahwist source, an Elohist source, and sometimes we don't know quite the source. And these sources are distinguishable by the kinds of words they use, the verbiage that they use, but also the name that they use for God. And so, for example, both the priestly and the Elohist source used Elohim, generic. It's like our English word God, Elohim, or El. The Yahwist source is the one that uses
The
almost
J.
exclusively Yahweh. It says J because the Germans who came up with it were the first to come up with this theory, said Yahweh. You know, it's a Germanic rendering of what we now know. And also they mistranslated Yahweh in those days because we hadn't discovered what was now we now know as the Masoretic text that told us what the vowels were in the word. But either way, the Y was a J in German, so they still call it the J source.
Okay,
And
thank you.
So verses, and I didn't do a deep dive into this like I did with the Noah lesson, where I divided up and spent a considerable amount of time noticing the differences. But I just take it on the authority of the scholars. When there's a consensus, it's like, okay, this is probably accurate. That the back half of this, 7 through 21, is from the Yahweh source, and the first 6 verses are ambiguous. Scholars have trouble pinning it down, and it also seems to be a standalone story. But they put it right next to the one with him questioning God about the land, because they seem like they're similar questions. These are promises you made; they haven't happened yet. What gives? You know.
Okay. Thank you.
I seem to be talking a lot today. I'm sorry. I apologize. But okay. But 400 years. Does that, is that a theme anywhere else? I mean, does 400 years stand out in any other part of history? Because, I mean, that was the anniversary that was celebrated last year. For 1619 was the year that slaves were first on our shores, and so that became a big number for the descendants of slaves in our country. And when I read that, I was like, oh, 400 years. Not that people were slaves that long, but people, really picked up on the 400th anniversary of enslaved Africans, and now African American people in our country. So I don't know if it
40
was 40.
40 is a big number. Generation might be 100 years. Scholars don't have. There's no consensus I'm aware of on how long exactly is a generation in the biblical world, what it might mean. So it could. If I had to guess, the average life of somebody who lives old in those days, somebody who lives old would be, 70, 80. Although we have these biblical characters living on past 100. Yeah. So I don't know. I don't know if that's meant to mean anything or not.
Yeah, just probably coincidence. It just kind of stood out, kind of smacked me in the face, but.
Well, four is, isn't 4 one of those numbers that's repeated? 4 is symbolic. Isn't that the number for man?
No,
and then 40, you've got the 40 days and the 40 nights and rain and whatever. And so anything with the 4 is kind of just fits into the system. Am I wrong? Does 4 not mean man?
Well, I've heard 40 and 12 and 7.
And 7 comes from 3 and 4. 3 being the Trinity and 4 being man.
I had not heard that until my dad always
Okay.
said that six
I'm wrong.
was no. I don't think there's any of that. I'm not aware of 3 or 4 being important numbers in the Hebrew scriptures. I know that 40 and 12 are, and sometimes 7 are 12. That's why it's 12 tribes of Israel. 40 days in the wilderness, 40 days and 40 nights, 40 years wandering.
12 disciples.
Yeah. Yeah.
So actually, Jewish numerology, Hebrew numerology, these numbers come from. And they're sort of sacred or quasi-sacred numbers that have more meaning than the specific number itself.
You got to be careful. I mean, I just listened to a book report, an audio book report. I listened to weird things. It was this dude who wrote a whole book on numerology, not related to the Bible, but just on his observations of the frequency of numbers like 11 and 22. The guy was crazy. He was poor. The poor fellow wasn't sleeping. He did confess to having mental breakdowns, and then he writes his book. And so I listened to a book report on it because I'm just fascinated by these kind of things. And it was an example of a person seeing coincidences in a frequency that began to think that things like there were 22 kids in his daughter's classroom. His daughter was 22 inches long when she was born, and these are all cosmic significance in his mind. And then he even basically what happens is, and I've noticed this with the number 11 myself, because my wife always says, "Oh, it's 11:11, kiss your niece." And so she, when we notice it, we maybe do that and kiss her niece. It's silly stuff. It's silly. But once I began to do that, I began to see 11s all the time. Just like when I worked at the corn mill and I filled these things called bulk trucks. I had never seen a bulk truck in my life, I thought, until after I started working with them. And then on the interstate, they are everywhere.
Right.
Coincidence? I think the universe is telling me something. Just kidding. It's just once you become aware of something or you begin to choose to look at something, you begin to see it. And so I've noticed with biblical numerology, and it coming from a tradition for this is a big deal. It seemed like how many 9s and how many 11s can you find in the book of Daniel, and then go 9/11 was and they don't even find the numbers 9 and 11. They find like words that have 9 letters in them next to words that have, and they're like right next to maybe a prophecy about Persia, and then they're like,
and you look for it cup.
June's in here. Do you want to say hi?
Hi.
Hi, June.
June.
Hello.
Well, I heard a person speaking not too long ago about the 666 for Satan, and he was saying that Hitler and Nero, and I don't know, he had a bunch of names. He said that people have figured out it was 666, and he says, so I sat down and I figured out how I could come up with 666 with my name, and so I think I'm not going to say anything about 3 and 12 and 40. I think those are very biblical numbers. I think they're there. But I think when you start messing around and combining and adding things to them, you're looking for trouble.
Yeah, with the I guess we'll end on this because this is someday we'll get to Revelation. Like, can you imagine?
I can't wait.
I hope we do, because that means that we'll have been together a long time. So
Perhaps we should start with Genesis and then just go right to the end and get Revelations and then fill in the middle.
Yeah, that would be good. Yeah, first, last.
So what else about 666? Okay, so there was a game that people would play in a graffiti game. People would play in Rome in those days, where you would put together a sequence of numbers on, like, say, a work project or a bridge or something like that. And somebody would come up and numbers would correlate with different letters, and you would decipher the message. And if you play that game with the numbers 666, it spells Nero. Nero. It was Revelations is a critique of Roman imperialism and everything's wrong with it, as kind of an archetype for, you could apply it to empires. You could apply it backwards to Egypt. You could apply it forward to other oppressive empires that don't have in mind the things of God. Interestingly enough, there are other translations, other versions of Revelation, other copies that are a little later, that have the number as 616. The number of the beast is 616. And if you play the same number game with it, that spells Gaius, which was Caligula's real name. So different emperor. It's like, well, that's not right anymore. Let's update it so let's be clear about who this is about. And so that's the whole story behind 666. So someday we'll get to Revelation.
I just Googled 4 and what it means in the Bible, and it doesn't say a whole lot except that it relates directly to the creative ability of God, and it was used to identify the different seasons and celebrations of feasts, that there were 4 seasons, and then also the 4 important elements: earth, air, fire, and water. So it is not really using the number 4, it's just relating it to different things that are made up of 4.
Interesting. Well, on that, I think I'm going to leave all of this discussion in because it was all kind of fun. I sometimes cut out the after discussion if we're just talking about the weather or whatever, but I think in this week I'm going to leave it for those who might be interested in viewing this later. But on that note, have a wonderful week and happy birthday, Sue. It is your birthday. I'm not going to let you.
No, it's not mine.
But happy birthday to you, Heath.
That's right. Yes, happy birthday.
Thank you. All right, well, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you soon, I hope.
All right.
Okay,
Okay.
bye-bye.
Peace.
Bye-bye. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.